morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody in here. Let's stand up and start the service off with some worship. I've searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. A man's empty grave, treasures that fade are never enough. Then you came along, put me back together. Every desire is satisfied. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. There's nothing is better than you. Nothing is better than you. There's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. Lord, there's nothing is better than you. Turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can.
the souls of all who come to the Father are restored, and the Church of Christ was born. Then the Spirit lit the flame. Now this gospel truth of old shall not kill, shall not fade. By His blood and in His name, in His freedom I am free. For the love of Jesus Christ, who has resurrected me. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. Praise forever to the King of
hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but only trust in Jesus' name. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but only trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When darkness seems to hide His face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, shall come with trumpet sound. Only I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne.
Father God, we thank you. We thank you for being our cornerstone, the cornerstone of our lives, our families, and our church. Help us, Lord, to depend solely on your strength, to know that in you we have the strength to testify, to witness, to be an encouragement to this world, to be a light. Help us to shine your light, no matter how difficult the obstacles that are presented. Lord, help us to just depend on you. We ask for your blessing on this day and the things that we do in your name. We love you, Lord. Amen.
Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong, Savior's love, through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong, Savior's love, through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all.
Thank you so much for worshiping with us today. Whether you're in person or online, please greet those around you, and we'll be back with you shortly.
right. Good morning, EastPoint. We're glad that you are here today. We've got a lively bunch here in person. I'm sure we have a lively bunch online. We're glad you're with us today. Hello. Hey, everyone. Good morning. We're back. So we're glad you're here. We hope that you had a great week. I hope that you had a chance to reflect on the message from last week. I know I did, and I think the encouragement that I want to continue here is that as we think about the kind of church we want to be, think about the areas where you can impact, where you can volunteer. If you'd like to start a small group, if you'd like to volunteer in the tech or audio or the band, or there's so many different avenues and things that can be done, and we haven't even started yet. So if you would love to help shape what EastPoint is becoming, we'd love to encourage you to do so. But we're glad you're here today. If you haven't texted 94000, we'd encourage you to do so. I realized this weekend that the text message service is kind of like the 2022 version of the cheesy church sign. So if you got the message yesterday, you know what that's about. And if you didn't get the message yesterday, then you should sign up so you get the messages, because it's a great way to stay connected and stay plugged in to what's going on here. And we're grateful to have the air conditioners in here so we can sit inside in the cool weather and be really comfortable. If you're on Facebook, we'd love for you to check in. Hashtag love God, love others. If you're live or on the live stream, you can click share and it goes right out to your feed. It's a great way to share us with your friends and family. And then we do have a couple of things coming up. So next Saturday, August 13th, we're going to have a work day here from 9 to 12. So I think it's at 9 to 12, right? So if you can be here, we'd love to have you out. We're going to do, JD, what type of task do you know yet? Okay. All right, we're going to be transferring things from the storage unit to Sonny's house. Thank you, Sonny, for volunteering the space. One of the things that is really important and core here at EastPoint is financial responsibility and good stewardship of God's money. And so the storage locker that we had raised their rates pretty substantially. And so thankfully, Sonny has volunteered her space. We're going to move things out, which is going to save us, I think, like $300 a month. Like it went up over like $110. So, we try to make the best decisions we can with the money we have here, and that's one thing that we knew needed to change. And unfortunately, the storage place was not flexible and wouldn't want to, go the other way. So we're grateful for folks like Sonny and others who have volunteered their space for us to do that. So we'll be doing that on Saturday at 9 a.m. Love to have you out. We have our communion service coming up on the 28th, and then really exciting on December 4th, which is Labor Day weekend. We're going to have a worship service here. So we're going to do what we've done before, have a time of music and sharing and just a really good time just celebrating Jesus. And so we hope that you can be here for that. And then last but certainly not least, we'd like to take the offering. You can give in the box on the table in the back. You can give online at eastpoint.org/give. And also just a quick plug, you can still give through Amazon. So if you go on Amazon, I forget, do we have the slide here? So if you go to Amazon, shop or smile.amazon.com and you link EastPoint, it's easiest to do in your app. So if you need any help, let me know, I can show you. But it's cool, whenever you make a purchase on Amazon, you actually get an email. If it's an eligible purchase, it tells you that like your purchase contributed towards the EastPoint cost. So that's a pretty cool way to help give to EastPoint. I'm sure like many of you, myself, I shop a lot on Amazon, and so hopefully those little things can go a long way. And if you do the app, you don't have to go to shop.amazon or smile.amazon each time. It just works. If you want to use the browser, you have to go to smile.amazon.com, and that registers it for EastPoint. So any questions, let me know afterwards, and I can help you out with that. But why don't I quickly ask God to bless today's service and offering, and then JD can come and share with us. God, we're grateful and thankful for who you are, and we're just grateful for you, God, and the love that you give to us and the care you give to us, and the space we have, we can come and be together and fellowship and have fun and worship you, God, and just celebrate who you are and what you've done in our lives. And we just hope that that excitement and love carries throughout our week and throughout our day with those around us, God. We ask right now that you please bless the offering we received today, multiply those funds, just help them to impact your ministry here at EastPoint. And then we ask right now for JD as he comes and brings the message to speak through him, God, and just open up our minds and our hearts, God, to your message that you have for us today. And we're just thankful for who you are, and we're grateful to be here. In your name we pray. Amen.
That's me. Thanks, Josh. All righty. You can tell you're getting older because he says if you do it on your phone, on your mobile device, because I guess we don't call them phones anymore. I've heard of that. They're referred to as tracking devices that can also make calls. But if you do it on there. I used to be like the cutting edge of computer stuff. I mean, I was there when VAX had this stuff where you could have a terminal for it, and then I would, could program in SPSS when I was doing my statistics stuff and learned all that program. I could make little programs so you had the little green bars that would make it do things. And now I can go to Smile, Amazon Smile, and place my orders. And now I find out if you do it on your phone, it does it automatically, because I admit, placed orders where I forgot to go to Amazon Smile. It's like, oh, I just sent that in. I forgot to do it through Smile. You could do it on your phone, which is intended for younger people to do it that way because it's far too small for some of us to see on our phone. It's like to shop on the phone to me is like, I don't know, that's like a torture or something. Not something I would be interested in doing. But it is great to have you all here. Jude and I were talking on the way in this morning as we were coming to church here. And I was just saying about how we don't know why God is allowing things to take so long for us to get approval from the county and all those things. But we know he's doing something. And one of the things he seems to be doing is that we have such a great group here. You guys are just awesome. We have this family, and there's other family members that you don't see right now, but they can see me. They can't see you, but they can see me because they're online. And as I get a chance to talk with them, and it's so good to talk with like Bonnie English and Patsy Graham and some of these folks that are out there that are watching, but they don't get a chance to be here with you. Hopefully it won't be that long before we get chances to be together. Something happened to my glasses where you guys are all in a cloud. So it's like virtual preaching. We were joking about how when Josh isn't here, he says we have virtual Josh playing the drums. When I'm not here, you have virtual JD, who actually, Josh is virtual JD. So he is my virtual presence. That's close enough. Some of you are out of the cloud now. That's good. What? What is that? You hear an echo? Well, at certain age, things happen. All right. Hey, we are talking, if you might remember, we're talking about the life of Daniel. And in case you're worried, saying, oh man, I wish I would have been here for some of that. I missed some of that. Hey, we're just like halfway, not even halfway through yet. So there's a lot that's there. It's good stuff. And today we're doing, Belshazzar's shame or folly. And on the way in, when I was telling Judy that the name of it is, she's like, so what is it? What is Belshazzar's folly? And I said, well, I guess you have to come to church and find out. So she's fortunately here, so she'll know that. We're going to be looking at a little bit of history as well. In fact, what we're going to be doing is we're going to have to back up in order to go forward. We're going to take one step back and 4 steps forward, so we will make progress today. But we're just going to back up by a verse because there's a foreshadowing that takes place in what's going on. And that's at the very end of chapter 4 when Nebuchadnezzar is giving it's like he was kind of praising and saying, this is what God has done to me. And remember, what he did to him was make him go crazy, and he ate grass. And you know what the thing that they say is the most likely disorder that he had is the disorder known as lycanthropy, which if you're a sci-fi fan, that means that he was a werewolf. But they have a disorder where a person behaves like a wolf, and that's what it's called. But, if you're into the lycanthropes, which is our werewolves, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, right there at the beginning of that whole thing, the original werewolf, or at least behaving like one. But Nebuchadnezzar said, at the end of this thing, he says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. And it's interesting because he's talking about the experience that he just went through. Because as you recall, he's walking around in his balconies, he's looking at stuff saying, look at the city that I have built. How awesome am I? And then he ends up going nuts. And he says God humbled him until he could recognize that God was the ruler of everything, that God was in charge. Now, some things you might not know about Nebuchadnezzar. One of the things he's very well known for, maybe most well known for, depends upon which source you read, is that he did a lot of building. He fortified the city of Babylon. Remember, he's over the whole Babylonian Empire, but Babylon, where he resided, was a city, and the empire was much larger. But he built canals, he built a number of modern systems there. That was one of the first places. The one you're probably most familiar with that he built was the Hanging Gardens, because he built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And he had done things to beautify. He had paved roads, and so he was kind of ahead of his time with some of this stuff. But he fortified the city quite well. That's interesting. We'll see in a little bit. But to look at this, there's going to be a lot of names, a lot of people that we're dealing with, and I want to give you the flow because we're going to start in chapter 5 with Belshazzar, who is a different king. But if we look at the graph here, this is kind of a timeline that you're looking at, and don't worry about trying to remember all those names. Nebuchadnezzar is right here. Nabopolassar, he didn't really rule for that short of a time, but the Neo-Babylonian period started about here. This is about 604 BC, and that was when the fall of Nineveh, and when he basically, the fall of Nineveh was a little earlier, but when he established himself separate, Nabopolassar established himself separate from the other things, and kind of but it was Nebuchadnezzar who really built the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But Nabopolassar, his father, started it. He dies. There's a number of things going on here, but you see Belshazzar, and you might say, well, was he or Nabonidus the next ruler? And yes, and so we'll look at that. And you're like, well, who's Gubaru? Never heard of Gubaru. That sounds like somebody off of Gomer Pyle. Well, we'll get to that as well, because you will notice there's a pink line here, and he's on the other side of the pink line. That's because where the white stops and the pink begins is the end of the Babylonian reign and the beginning of the Persian reign. And so that's what it is. So he's on the Persian side of the line, but we'll see why he's down here eventually. But basically this thing is covering, like I say, Nabopolassar was actually ruling from about 625, but it's about 606 when we start here. In 604, Nebuchadnezzar takes over, and the fall of Babylon was in 538 BC. So the entire Neo-Babylonian period, less than 100 years, 70-some years long. So it wasn't really long. And I said don't worry about those names, because we'll look at this next slide where you can worry about the names. Whoops. You don't have the blue one? Oh. I worked a long time on this slide. I've just got a moment of grief here. But what it shows is all the connections that are in there. In fact, there it is. You all got it? And it shows it kind of like almost as a family tree, because you've got Nabopolassar who conquered and was the ruler there and kind of established it. Under him was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had some children. His oldest was named Evil Murdoch. Now, don't think of evil as that means he's bad. The word evil meant man. So he was basically, that means he is Marduk's man. And Marduk was the primary god, or one of the primary, but probably the primary god of the Chaldeans, which you remember the Chaldeans are the Babylonians at this point in time. So, and Nabopolassar, his name means protect my son, which is fascinating because his son is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's name means Nebu, protect the land or protect the kingdom. It's more about, which is also, I say, it's interesting because he did so much building during his lifetime. Now, some things to keep in mind with all this, and it gets very confusing when it comes to the names. There's different spellings for the names. These are probably not given names at birth. These are probably names that, that became almost like titles, or that were adopted at some point in time, which was a common practice back then. Just like we've been going through the book of Daniel, but Daniel was also given the name Belteshazzar, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit. But thank you, good job. Look at that. Okay, protect the area. Evil Murdoch is Murdoch's man, or Marduk's man rather. And you'll see here, Labish Marduk, and we'll get on to who that is. Right here is a critical figure. This is Nitocris, which there's so much debate about her. Oh, sorry about that. The cord was pulling on me, so I pulled back. There's a lot of debate about her in the literature. Some say she wasn't even a literal person. Some say she was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She's a woman, and we know her to be of Egyptian descent. In fact, Nitocris can only be found in terms of what her name is about and stuff like that, in Egyptian stuff. And there is so much debate about what her name means that I just left it out. Because it's like, I would just have to like spin a wheel and pick one at random. But what we do know is she was a woman of power, that she was of Egyptian descent, but most sources put Nebuchadnezzar as her father. Now, another tricky thing that you're going to run across in the Bible is that there's only one word that they have for male ancestor. And so they call it father. So it could be your grandfather, your great-grandfather. It could be a number of levels, and they would say your father. And we're going to see that right away in chapter 5. But Nitocris was married to Neriglissar. There's other pronunciations of his names, but this is what he's called. And Neriglissar, what is he? I don't remember. It means Nergal, protect the king. Now these first things like Nebu, those are gods. Nebo is probably the same god as Nebu that he has here. So we're looking at some of these things. So when you see that Nebo, Nabonidus, that's usually referring to the same god. Nergal is another god, and it just means Nergal says to protect the king. If you saw some other spellings for this, you would understand why it says king, but it's not showing there. But he was part of a group that killed evil Marduk. He was ruling for 2 years after Nebuchadnezzar. And there was a coup, if you will. So he killed his brother-in-law, because, of course, Nitocris and evil Marduk would have been brother and sister. Neriglissar killed him and took over the throne. He lasted a little while, actually longer than evil Marduk did, but then there was another coup. Okay? And that coup involved Nabonidus, because he got killed. He took the throne. Nabonidus married Nitocris and killed his son, Labishai Marduk, which means Marduk, may I not come to shame. May I not come to shame. Don't let me be embarrassed. So Nabonidus kills him and takes the throne. So now he is the king. He is known as the last king of Babylon. And he has a son. His oldest son name is Belshazzar. And that's where we start our story, is with Belshazzar. And you're thinking, I don't quite see how all this is going to fit together. Okay. If you start with the book, it says that the king, Belshazzar, was having a party. Now, why is he called the king? Well, he was called the king because his father, Nabonidus, was the king, but he shared the authority with his son because Nabonidus was fascinated with Sumerian religion, and so he took off to basically a vacation home that he had, and it was out in the desert, and he went there for like 10 years to study Sumerian religion, and he left the control of Babylon to his son Belshazzar. So Belshazzar was like a second king. He wasn't the top dog, but he functioned as a king. You might have called him a viceroy or something of that nature, but obviously he preferred the term king. So he is known as the king, Belshazzar. So if you get confused about how did they have two kings at the same time, that's the reason. And so much of it is about Nabonidus' desire to go out and study his religion. And Nabonidus simply means Nebo be praised. That's what Nabonidus means. Nebo again, that one of those gods that they followed. There was about 200 Chaldean gods. There was 12 to 20 that were really the most important ones that they followed the most. With Nebuchadnezzar, Marduk kind of took he was like the top dog for him. Some others put other ones towards the top, but there's many of them were insignificant because they started worshiping all sorts of gods, but then they had their favorites. But so Belshazzar has this big party, and he invites, it says, 1,000 of his lords, which I think is a pretty good sized party. And he says that they're drinking and they're getting drunk. And I almost included here, do you know the song by, who wrote the song One Beer? I can't remember the name of the band that does that. But isn't it amazing what one beer turns into? And I think of that with Belshazzar. You know, he's getting together, they're drinking, they're getting drunk. And he says, go to their treasury and bring out the temple vessels that, he says, my father, Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he's actually his grandfather, but of course they don't have the term for that. So he said that Nebuchadnezzar captured and took away from the Jerusalem temple. Bring out those dishes of gold and, you know, and show everybody, he's showing off. He's got this big party, and he brings out all these golden vessels. And it says vessels, so we don't know, probably cups and plates, and I don't know what kind of food they were serving or what they were doing, but he brings out all these golden vessels. And then they fill them with wine, and they're drinking out of them, and they're having a good time. And one of the things that they do, it says that they were praising the gods of gold and of wine and of prosperity. And they were having this celebration with the temple items that during all of this. And so this is what he's in the middle of. And right in the middle of that, a human hand appears. And it starts writing on the wall. And we know from if you read it, you'll see this. And if you think, JD, you're just making stuff up. This is a ludicrous story. It's Daniel chapter 5. You know, so it's there. But in fact, and all the other stuff, search it on Wikipedia or on Google. So it's, you know, the history stuff I'm giving you there it's all out there too. This is an accepted history of the things that took place and who did what when, with some names being tweaked around here because they did weird stuff with names. But the hand is writing. It's like right across from Belshazzar, King Belshazzar, and he sees it writing. But it shows, and the finger starts to write on the wall. Now, a thing that's fascinating to me is it was a plaster wall. So if it's writing on the wall, my assumption is it's carving the letters into the plaster wall. You know, it's like because it didn't whip out a Crayola or, you know, a number 2 pencil and start writing. The finger was writing on the wall, so it was undoubtedly carving the words into the wall. And Belshazzar got a little afraid. In fact, it says that the king's color changed, he blanched, and his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. In short, Belshazzar was losing it. He was very afraid. So he called for all of his enchanters and the Chaldeans and the astrologers, and he bribed them, saying, whoever can solve this, I will make third in the kingdom. And now you understand that better now when he says, I will make the third ruler in the kingdom, because he's the second ruler. That's the highest position he had the power to give away. So he couldn't say, I'll make you number 2 in power, as you sometimes see kings saying, I'll make you second in power. He says, I'll make you third in power, because I'm second, and you're not going to be above me. You know, so that he said, I'll put a chain around you, I'll make you the third ruler, your name will be praised, you'll be all this. Now, what's significant about him calling for these folks, you may not know that the Chaldeans are the grandfathers of astronomy. They were the first people that would study the stars and try to interpret what the gods meant by watching the stars. So they were actually the grandfather of astronomy and astrology, you know. But they would watch the stars, and they would try to do that. In fact, they were the first people to ever have a 7-day week. They came up with that, and they did that by watching the stars and the patterns, and they figured that there were 7 days to the week. And so that started with the Chaldeans. So who knew that you were every week practicing something that started in ancient Babylonia with the Chaldeans? But because they were doing that. And just as another little sideline to sort of help you how all this stuff kind of ties together, you remember when Jesus was born, that there were astrologers. We called them magi in most of the songs that we sing, but they were astrologers from the east that came and visited and said we were watching the stars and we saw what happened and knew something was going on. Most likely Babylonians or Chaldeans, because at this point in time Babylon had been wiped out. It never recovered. But most likely Chaldeans who had been spread around. So I just think fascinating little side thing that those wise guys in Bethlehem we're reading about now. But no one could interpret it. No one could interpret what it says. And so, Belshazzar is even more afraid. It goes again with the descriptions about how his color changed even more. And he's shaking. He's so afraid. And so then there's an intervention by the Queen Mother. So who's the Queen Mother? Nitocris, this Egyptian woman who was around. And she says, King live forever. Because they've got to praise him even if it's her son. She says, King live forever. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Because the words, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let your thoughts not alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. So she had it a little off, but she basically had the right idea. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel. Whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. Now, if you've caught on here, there's Belshazzar, who's the king, and Belteshazzar, who's the name for Daniel. And they actually have the same meaning. It's just, again, one of those things where it's a little different spelling, because Bel was their way of pronouncing it. It was the Chaldean expression of the name you're probably more familiar with, which is Baal, or Baal, if you want to get fancy with it. But you've heard a lot of stories in the Old Testament about Baal. And this is the same God. And Belshazzar means Baal, protect the king. Daniel was named Belteshazzar, Baal, protect the king, undoubtedly because of the position he was put in as the king's advisor, and his job was to interpret, and he was to protect the king. So we've got two guys that are essentially having the same name. That might have been a little different pronunciations. It might have been like a Debbie and a Deborah, or a John and a Jonathan, but they essentially have the same name. And they say, bring him in. And so Daniel's brought before Belshazzar. They bring him in. And Belshazzar tries to flatter and tries to bribe Daniel. And he says, you are that Daniel. And I think it's fascinating that he uses his Hebrew name. I don't know if that's because of his ego and says, I'm not going to call you by the name that's equal to mine, or if it's because he's saying, I'm going to recognize the fact that you are a Hebrew child. He says, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show me the interpretation. They could not show the interpretation of the matter, but I have found that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Same offer he made to the other guys. Now, one of the fascinating things here is he talks about Nebuchadnezzar like being his father, his ancestor. And it's so clear because you see the family resemblance in that he goes to everything else first. Isn't that what Nebuchadnezzar kept doing? He kept going to everything else first, and then when he ran out of options, he said, oh yeah, there's that guy that solved all the puzzles. Every time we got stuck, that solved stuff for us. Maybe we should consult him, just like we do, right? because we run into stuff, we get stuck, we're like, I don't know where to go, I don't know what to do. We call everybody, we worry about things, we fret and be frantic about things and run around, and then we go, oh yeah, maybe I should talk to God about this. Maybe I should go there. But see, we're kind of Nebuchadnezzar's and Belshazzar's as well. And I love Daniel's answer to Belshazzar. He answered the king and said, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So he's saying, I don't need your stuff. Now, Daniel was probably already a pretty wealthy guy at this point in time. One thing we know, he's an old guy at this point in time. Daniel lived well into his 80s, and he was probably above 80 at this point in time. So because he was there very early on with Nebuchadnezzar. We saw that Nebuchadnezzar ruled for like 43 years. He went through all this, so he's no spring chicken, let's just put it that way. He's been around, he knows things, he's seen things, and we've seen in other times, Daniel's bold. He's not afraid. And he goes back, and what he does is, as he starts the interpretation, he starts by saying, first off, I'm going to recount a little history for you, because there's some things that you have forgotten. He says, and he starts with the usual, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And he starts right off, he's clarifying, not the gods, the Most High God. And he's very intentional about saying, this isn't one of your 200. This is the one, the only one that I have ever served, the one who was able to deliver your victims from fire, the one who has been able to establish you and put you in, the one who your grandfather, your father, who recognized and at the end of his life was saying, there is one power, and he is the one who can set up and tear down kingdoms. There's only the one. But he says, he said he had the one. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and language trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind, and sets over it whom he will. So he says, you remember this? This is stuff you should know, Belshazzar. Because if you remember that timeline that we looked at, that the marks on there were not the periods of a person's life, they were the period that they were the ruler. And so his lifeline would have started earlier. He would have been alive for much of what was going on here and has seen it. But he goes on, and he basically chastises Belshazzar. He says, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. He says, you knew about all this. I'm not telling you something you didn't know. You knew this, and you still refused to humble your heart. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Now, I don't know if Daniel was making a pun because of the hand that was writing on the wall. He says you're in his hand. The God whose hand in which you rest, you have not honored, but while that hand's writing on the wall, you're busy blaspheming to the limit. Do you remember when David decided to move the Ark of the Covenant back into Jerusalem because it had been captured and taken away, and by the Philistines, and they're moving it back in, and at one point, one of the mules stumbled, the thing rocked, and the priest reached out and touched the ark and died instantly. Okay? Because God says, there are some things that I've made very clear about how you're supposed to do them. And there's a lot to that story, and don't look at it just like, oh, it was a magic box that couldn't be touched. That's not the point. But the point is, God says, some things I have made holy and are to be treated holy. They are to be set aside. That's what the word holy means, is set aside. It's set apart. And he says, these vessels, which there is what feels like a huge amount of the Old Testament dedicated to telling all the details of exactly how they should be made and how they should be used and who could use them and how they could use them and what they'd be used for. That was all laid out as part of God's, as he was basically laying down the whole idea of, I will be your God and you will be my people. There are ways in which certain things are handled because I'm setting you aside, because I am making you holy. Just like, and they are almost representations of who we are. He says, you don't misuse what I have declared holy, which has huge ramifications for us now, which we didn't even fully understand until we got into the New Testament and started seeing Jesus as he started looking at the whole issue of, you are holy. And I don't want you misused and used for other things. And Paul talks about that, about how, when we sin against our bodies, when we treat ourselves as though we're not holy, it brings scars upon us that just don't go away. And he says, Belshazzar, you treated what was holy in a profane way. So you blasphemed against me, and you treated this like it's terrible. So Daniel says, here's what's going to happen. He says, then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed, and this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Persian. This is the interpretation of the name. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed, and the balance was found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And I love the boldness of Daniel, because he doesn't just say, oh, well, here's what it says. Remember with Nebuchadnezzar, how he would be very upset, and Nebuchadnezzar would have to say, don't be afraid, tell me what it says. I know that you've understood it, and I can tell that you're upset about it. Daniel's over that stuff. Now he's like, Belshazzar, you're a knucklehead. You have had all these things. You've had every advantage. This stuff was taught you. Nebuchadnezzar didn't know about any of this stuff until he captured me and brought me into his kingdom and started learning. And God used me as a messenger to you. But he had your grandfather. We don't know really about his father, but we do know this evil Murdoch's man, that he released from prison the prophet that Nebuchadnezzar had in prison when he captured Jerusalem. So he was releasing. Most authorities think that was under Daniel's influence, that Nebuchadnezzar's son went ahead and released prisoners that his father had done, prisoners that were significant to the Jewish religion, is what the bottom line there was. So he released them. But he says, you had these examples. You knew better. And just like Spider-Man's uncle, he's saying, with much power comes much responsibility. You had the advantages, you had the power, you had the teaching, you are accountable. And you've been weighed and found wanting. Your kingdom is done. Now, the one thing if there's something that's redeemable there about Belshazzar, is that he kept his word. He ordered that a purple robe be brought in and put on Daniel, and a gold chain be put around his neck, and he declared him the third ruler of Babylon. Now, I don't know if you remember that from the story of Babylon, that he was the third ruler, which gets really exciting the next day. He did all that, but then Babylon falls. He said that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. He was killed that night. Now, We know when that happened, because that was the fall of Babylon. Because what also had happened, it's not in these verses, but it's in the history, is that his father came back. And he was there, he returned to a divided kingdom. So he is considered the king that lost Babylon, the last king of Babylon, because he was number one king. Belshazzar was number two, remember? But Belshazzar then died. We don't know if his father died or not. But if he did, guess who was the ruler of Babylon? That would be Daniel, because he was number three. Number two was gone, so he was at least number two at that point in time, which is fascinating. But it says that it gave it to Darius. Now you might say, JD, Darius wasn't even on that chart you put on. And if I go in online and take a look at it, Darius was a couple of years later. And in fact, I thought it was Cyrus who conquered Babylon. And I would say, you're right. It was Cyrus who initially conquered Babylon. Notice he said the Medes and the Persians. I mean, the Medes and the Persians that were there. It was a divided kingdom that they were ruling together. Okay? And Gubaru, who we talked about before, how he shows up there on a timeline, he was undoubtedly the general that Cyrus used to conquer. He was the one that was there on site, but he did it on Cyrus's behalf. The victory goes down in history as being Cyrus's, just like we have all kinds of victories that might be accounted to MacArthur, whether he was there or not, because he sent the men, you know. And so Gubaru was probably the general who conquered it, and since he was the top man on that, he kind of shows up as the ruler for the time that's there. But Cyrus took it and he gave it to Darius, who became the king there. So Daniel, you could say that Daniel served under, I mean, a slew of kings, but including Cyrus the Great and Darius, which to me is kind of fascinating, because the way, one thing is the way it all lines up exactly with what we know about history. And there was, for a while, there was a lot of debate saying, could it have happened this way? You know, who was this guy Belshazzar? We don't really know who he was. And then with all the erosion that was taking place around one of the banks right there at the Euphrates, the stuff, and a whole bunch of tablets were exposed that came out. And they found all kinds of records and banking records of Belshazzar having a lot of land and property and did trading and had a lot of banking deals, and again used multiple names and different spellings and different ways to do it, and so this stuff gets confusing, and it takes a lot of guys smarter than me to figure out how does it all work and how does this name fit with there and how do we determine who's the same guys and all that stuff. But the historians worked all that stuff through it, and they showed it, and they stopped doubting about Belshazzar being a king that was there ruling at that time, and that he did in fact die when when Babylon fell. The night, so Daniel's in there. He's not just telling him that the writing on the wall is telling you something about your kingdom. He says there's an entire empire shift that's happening because you couldn't pay attention to what you had been taught, to what you had seen, to what was right before you. And so as I'm reading this stuff, because I get obsessed with it. I tell Judy that I don't like to study, and then like 8 hours later, I'm still in there. She goes, "Did you eat lunch?" And I said, "Oh, I forgot to eat lunch. I was studying, and I just got caught up with it." And you know, it's like, and so I enjoy the study, even though I'll tell you that I hate it, because the thought of it bothers me, but the actual doing of it seems to get me excited. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, where am I being taught things that I ignore? Where am I seeing the hand of God work? And I'm going, wow, that's a fascinating story. Got nothing to do with me. How often is God intervening in my life and I'm writing it off as something else? You know, I go through that with the church building here, because I start to feel sorry for myself and God, why is the county being so rough on us? Why can't we just get our approvals? Why can't we do this? And it's like, it's got to be your will that all comes through. And I'm thinking, oh, are you trying to teach me something? Am I supposed to learn to be patient? Like you talked about there in the Bible about people being patient, but certainly you didn't mean me. And not certainly about things that are related to you, God, because I shouldn't be patient about stuff that's related to you. That's just I should be patient in grocery lines when somebody's in the 8 items or less aisle with 2 carts full. And he tells me all the time, JD, you don't have a church. You haven't learned it. I have a church, and I've allowed you to play a role in that church. But I got this all under control. This isn't up to you. And I go, oh, I'm being Belshazzar, aren't I? I've seen all these stories. I watched the way that you've worked in different things. But I said, yeah, but that's not here. God's not going to do that with me. He's not going to do that with my church. He's not going to pull out something that is totally unexpected. And I think that it's something that we can fall into, and we can become Belshazzars. We can take what is holy, like ourselves, and we can treat ourselves in unholy ways. I used to, when I was younger, I would be provocative with people. It's a good thing I outgrew that. But I used to tell people, please don't love me the way you love yourself, like the Bible says. Because I've seen how you love yourself, and I think I deserve better. So, but don't we do that? One of the things I used to do in therapy is people would be going on and on about how awful they are and the things that they would say about themselves. I said, would you make that same sentence to your child, your 7-year-old child? And would you make it every day, the way you make it to yourself every day? Many times, oh, I would never do that. Why not? Well, that would just be cruel. I said, exactly. Exactly. We treat ourselves as if we are not holy vessels that God has made for His glory, for His enjoyment. He enjoys us. He loves us. And when we treat as bad something He has made, you know what we're doing? We are insulting the Creator. Many years ago, I made this podium out of a tree that came down in my father-in-law's backyard, and I intentionally left a few flaws in it. We went over that before, but if you come up and say, that is the ugliest, stupidest podium I've ever seen, you know what the podium feels? Absolutely nothing. You know what the maker feels? A little bit lower. And when we treat as unholy and defile what God has called holy, we are saying to the Creator, the God of the universe, you didn't do a very good job. You really messed up here. And the handwriting's on the wall. Are you reading what's on the wall? Are you seeing it before you? Are you listening to what God is saying to you? And are you responding to what He's teaching you? Because Belshazzar didn't. And entire empires were changed as a result. Let's pray. God, I just thank you that you do love us, that you do make us holy, that you do consider what is holy sacred unto you, and that it is not to be abused and taken lightly, and that you give us opportunities, and you show us examples, and you teach us things. Lord, help us to respond to all of that. Help us to see when you are showing us something. Help us to know when you are giving us a lesson that we need to learn from. And help us to recognize that you have made us holy, and that we should behave and we should act like the children of the Most High, that we are heirs to the King. We thank you for the honored position which you have given us. In Christ's name, amen. Next Saturday, going to be moving a lot of stuff. If you're like, I hate moving stuff, well, show up. We'll find other stuff for you to do. We got things here that can be done. We got plants need attended to. We got lots of jobs. So we'll see you next Saturday. I'll see you next Saturday, but I'll got to be at your house. Yes.